Okay. Okay, now I'm recording, I think. Okay, hi everybody. Yes, so this took me about 10 years to write. It seems very short for 10 years, I know, but I kept moving universities, and every time I moved university from one to the other, they said, this kind of book does not get you tenure because it's for teachers. It's not a research book. So every time I started, even though I had the contract with Michigan, every time I went somewhere else, they said, so I'd been to Alabama, and then I went to DC, and then I went to Georgia State. They said, well, don't write this and try and get a tenure. Once you've gotten tenure, then you can write this, but it doesn't count as much as writing a research book. So I kept putting it off and putting it off, and then it finally came out in 2018. But the contract, I had entered into the contract in I think it was longer than 10 years. I think it was 2005 or 2006. So my editor was very, very patient, and I was very lucky that she said that no one else came along to write the book in the interim. So, because I kept saying to her, would you like me not to write this book anymore and tear up this contract? And she said, no one else is writing this book, so you could do it. So anyway, it's been quite a part of my life for quite a long time. So today we are going to look at the introduction in chapter 1, and then we are, hold on, I'm just messing around with my things. I have also so you have the PowerPoint, you have reading post 9, activity 6, and because activity 6 is a sample lesson plan, is a lesson plan, which is to give you an idea of exactly what your lesson plans need to look like for the end of the semester, so you don't have any surprises. I've given you a sample lesson plan to work from too. So it's not perfect, but it gives you a good idea. Okay, is my screen sharing paused, or is it moving around? Okay, so I think I've done something wrong. Resume share. There we go. All right. Okay, good. So I wanted to ask, because I wrote this essentially for you, you're my intended audience. I wanted to ask you some of these questions. So it's completely, up to you if you want to talk to me about it. But it's the idea is that just to get an idea of your experience with intonation. So if any of you that are here today have had an introduction to intonation as part of a teaching program, what it looked like for you. If any of you have tried to work with intonation in the past with a textbook, or how that's worked for you, and your own experience in language learning, if not language teaching, if you've ever had any focus on intonation. So I just want to sort of throw that out there to the 5 of you. And is anybody, 6 of you, is anyone gonna pick that up for me?
I just go first because
Thank you, Ari.
I'm not a native English speaker. As far as learning as a student, I'm sure one of my teachers taught me, but unfortunately, I don't remember how she instructed me for intonation. With my students, and I only try to help Vietnamese students, because they have some of the Vietnamese students have a very strong intonation, so to speak, up and down, and I just try to help them. But it's really not something, I have not received any professional training. I don't have it in textbook. I'm just trying to make it a little more natural.
Right.
That's all I've been doing. So I'm looking forward to learning from this class how to help my students.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's a very typical experience, I think. particularly for EFL environments, to have, you know, a couple of bits and pieces here and there, but not a whole lot. Yeah. Anyone else?
As a language learner, do tonal languages come into the umbrella of intonation, or is that something?
Yeah, well, sort of. Yeah, tonal languages, it's phonemic tone. It's morphemic or phonemic. So the tone is carried on the individual phoneme, right?
Mm-hmm.
So intonation languages, but what is true is that tone languages also have intonation. So I've done some work with Chinese with how intonation sort of rides on top of tonal languages. So but the relationship between the way pitch is used on tone and pitch is used on intonation is more complicated than it is in what we might think of as intonation languages that don't carry tone.
And as a teacher, I haven't taught, but you know, I've worked with my own children on making sure that when they ask a question, they, you know, rise up, and if they make a statement, they go down, you know, things like that.
That's cool. That's cool. Aaliyah, you had anything, or Caroline?
The only thing that comes to mind with intonation was in Spanish classes, but it wasn't actually taught as its own subject. It was only briefly mentioned when we were discussing how to ask and answer questions.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that also sounds very, so syntactic use of intonation is something that's very common. Yeah, syntactic teaching of the use of syntactic patterns. And Caroline, anything to add?
I haven't taught before, so I'm not familiar with teaching intonation. I mean, I learned French for a very short period of time, but intonation was never discussed or anything like that. In like all honesty, it's a little, what is it? Not daunting to me, but it's something I'm definitely looking forward to learning about.
Yeah, no, I think it is daunting. I'm glad you brought that up. And I think it is because we don't have any experience of it. In fact, it's no different from any of the other, as we'll look at, it's no different from any of the other grammatical systems of English that you've spent time with. So you spent time with syntax. So you know what a noun is and a verb is and an article is, and you've done that in 501 and 555, and you're familiar with it also from your own education. Models of intonation follow the same kind of grammatical pattern. In other words, you can name the different parts of what intonation is comprised of. And some of them are like super easy, like, you know, if you think of nouns, right? Nouns, generally speaking, are pretty easy. They're things. But then occasionally, certainly with your students, you'll come up with a tricky one, like I don't know, a general noun like courage, for example, and you'll say courage is a noun, and your learners will say, or your teachers, if you're teaching, will say that can't be a noun, that's not a thing. You know, a noun has to be an object, but it is a thing, right? It's an abstract noun. So some nouns are a little more tricky than other nouns, no different than in intonation. Some things are very straightforward. They're excellent examples of their categories, and some are a little more sort of waving around, a bit wishy-washy, but that's no different from any other system that you will have in grammar. But I think it is daunting, and it's daunting because we don't talk about it, and because we don't talk about it, and there seems to be an idea that somehow it will just, like by osmosis, there's no reason to talk about it, you'll just learn it. when we start looking at the actual primitives, what the system looks like, it's so brand new. It's like, oh my God, this is a whole new system. Who knew? And you know, this is the first time I see this thing. So Caroline, you know, you shouldn't be daunted, because we're gonna have a look at it and we'll do just fine.
I am, honestly.
Yeah, but I think people are. I mean, you know, and I think I've said this to you before. One of the reasons I ended up in phonology, I think, was because I was like, oh God, what is this phoneme thing? And what is this intonation thing? And so, you know, I understand that feeling. Anyway, so the idea of this book was to really give teachers more confidence, as much as anything else, in what they're hearing, what they think they're hearing, what they hear from their learners. And you know, so as much as anything else, I want you to think about it as a way to build your confidence by understanding a lot more about the system. And there's some things that you'll say, yeah, sure, that totally makes sense. And there are other things that you'll say, oh, that's a tad more tricky, but that's just no different than anything else. So the part of the sound system that this covers is the suprasegmental part, right? So we have that down here. This is the example that we've been looking at all semester. So we've now done this part, this consonant and vowel part, and we're now doing this part, which basically we're going to say is three overall things. So one is units, so how we split the stream of speech into big units and how we use pauses to do that. Another one is what's called prominence, which is basically stress. So it's which words in a sentence we will stress and why we stress them. And the third one is the use of pitch. And in intonation, there's two uses of pitch. One is pitch height, so I can go higher or lower. And one is contour, so I can do a rise, I can do a rising contour, or I can do a falling contour. So those are the two ways that we use pitch. So that's essentially the primitives that we're going to identify for suprasegmentals or intonation. So as we've just discussed, it might be new to many of you, because typically it's not introduced in either teaching or learning until much later on in some cases. And in some ESL, traditional ESL, EFL textbooks, it often doesn't appear at all, or it appears only as Anne was describing it when she said questions go up and statements go down. So you have a very basic presentation of the relationship between syntax and intonation, which unfortunately turns out not to be true, but anywho. So it might feel like you're going to have to go back and relearn some things, which is what we were just saying. So I want you to stay with me, because it really is the same. It's like learning the different morphemes, you know, bound, free morphemes, you know, derivational morphemes, it's phonemes, different, and it's just like that. You're just learning a different set of concepts that go into a system. So again, it might seem more complicated only because you're unfamiliar with it. I recently had to do something on the grammar book. I don't know how many of you know the grammar book, Celsa Mercer grammar book. It's like about that big. It's a tome, and it has all the grammatical rules, syntactical rules that it's possible to have in English. And if you look, for example, at the article or at the chapter on articles, so and the and zero articles, it's really long. And it's really long because there are tons of little rules, okay, just tons of them. And it's complicated. And we recognize that as teachers, and we recognize that students have a problem with it, and we recognize that we need to take it in pieces, right? So we tend to take it in pieces. Textbooks take it in pieces, and they do a little bit at a time, and they try and do the easy stuff first, and then the harder stuff with definite and indefinite and so on. So it's not that this is any different from that. It's just that you're used to looking at that and hearing those terms, and you're not used to hearing some of the terms that you'll hear on this. But it's the same concept. So there's a wonderful anecdote that's in the book that is a friend of mine, Marnie Reed, did a study in Boston University and with her student. And what she wanted to do was test her ESL students' awareness, right, of the functions of intonation. So to do that, she used some of the more tricky functions of intonation that you will recognize, but you don't necessarily know. So for example, one of her examples was the teacher didn't grade your papers. So the provenance has shifted to teacher as opposed to didn't or papers. So the teacher didn't grade your papers, which obviously means the next thing is somebody else did, right? The student next door or whatever. Anyway, the point is that the someone else did, not the teacher. So the study noted that most of the students consistently missed this implication and rejected it. When they were told that that was what that means, that a native speaker would understand, would say, well, who did grade my paper then, if it wasn't the teacher? They said, oh, I don't think that can be right. I think you're making that up. Stating, at least one of the students stated, quote, if this intonation thing is really important, someone would have told us by now, unquote, which I thought was marvelous because it explains a lot about why learners can come to a late intermediate and advanced stage of learning and have had no discussion of this whatsoever. Then all of a sudden a teacher says, well, it's actually really important the way that you say it, particularly if you're going into the workplace or something like that and you don't want to upset people. You have to think about how you're coming across in terms of impression management. And it comes as a complete surprise because they've never heard of this before. So I always thought that was wonderful and sort of explains a lot about what we sometimes call teacher-induced error, or you can call it textbook-induced error, or basically this idea that we're skewing the idea of what's important to our students by what we focus on as opposed to the reality, you know. So because we spend our time focused on small parts of syntax, we skew the reality of the students into thinking that the most important thing is these small parts of syntax. Well, they're important, but other things are important too. So so the approach that we're going to look at takes the entire system. It doesn't take pieces of the system, it takes the entire system, and it looks at it through our most recent understandings of in research of the structure and the function of intonation across text. So across text means across conversations, across a lecture like I'm giving now, you know, how intonation, structure, prominence, pitch, and pause structure the text that you're hearing or speaking. Okay. So this was in the first thing you'll read in the introduction, if you haven't read it already, is what I call preliminaries. And this was really just to make sure that people who came to the book have an idea of things that you guys did in 555 and 501. So that the basic idea of what intonation is, or what discourse is, that you covered in 555, that I assume that that stuff is sort of learned already. So I don't spend any time going through that again. So the first one is intonation, of course, which is also called suprasegmental features and also called prosodic features. And intonation is sometimes is considered to be the very narrow definition of pitch, of whether pitch goes down or pitch goes up or high or low. So in terms of discourse intonation, we take it to mean this whole gamut of pitch, pause, and prominence. Discourse pragmatic, this means it's the role of intonation across texts, so not in individual sentences, right? I mean, it does apply to individual sentences, but we can only see the real structure and function of how intonation contributes to the language by looking across texts. And then pragmatic means the intonation is connected to the social and linguistic choices of speakers and hearers, okay? So it's not, intonation is not based in syntax. It's its own system, right? It has a relationship with syntax, it has a relationship with other systems, linguistic systems, but it's its own separate thing. And we're going to look at the ways in which that's true. And then finally, the intonation is a grammatical system. Now, by that, I don't mean it's a syntactic system, right? So I mean grammar in the very overall sense of a linguistic system, a systematized set of choices in which if you pick one choice, it means you're not picking the other choice, right? And that there's a limited amount of choices. There's not an endless amount of choices that we can choose from, right? So if you look in the book in the same way that if we see a sentence like white dog A instead of a white dog, we know that it's grammatically incorrect, right? Syntactically incorrect, because it needs to be a white dog, not white dog A, right? So you can do the same thing with intonation. But because intonation is largely tacit, we don't tend to notice what's happening unless it's not what we expect, right? And then if that choice often is taken as meaningful, even though it isn't a meaningful choice, it's a learner choice. So if things don't go according to our perception, that's when we tend to think of it as being different. So one example is Deborah Tannen. I don't know how many of you have read Deborah Tannen's stuff. She's the very popularist linguist who appeared on Oprah a few times in her years. She's at Georgetown University. And she identified something that she calls machine gun talk, which is the talk of New Yorkers, which essentially is incredibly fast. So I remember my brother-in-law came from Oxford to America, to New York, and he hated it because he thought everybody was incredibly rude. And the reason he thought they were rude is he kept feeling like he was being cut off all the time. Like he'd start to say something or he'd not even properly be finished and someone else would come in and say something. This is what Deborah Tannen has called machine gun talk. She says it's very common in the Northeast and it's a very fast paced kind of talk. So if you're not from the Northeast, you feel like you're being cut off or, and it can be very disturbing, as in fact my brother-in-law found. A exact opposite version of that is in my first chapter or my preliminary somewhere, where this was a researcher, an anthropological linguist who went to Lapland, and in this story he was explaining that, you know, you could be in their house, these people's house, for 10 minutes and you'd only say 5 or 6 things, because the pauses is the exact opposite of machine gun talk. The pauses between exchanges were hugely long. So he says, we would offer coffee. After several minutes of silence, the offer was accepted. We would ask a question, more silence and a long wait. more wait. Each visit lasted approximately an hour, and there may only have been 6 or 7 exchanges. So this is the exact opposite. Generally speaking, in northern, sort of mid North America, we have a no gap, no overlap rule, which means if you start speaking and someone else starts speaking, one of you will cut off usually, and the gap between turns can't be too long. It certainly can't be anything like that long, because that would feel incredibly weird. So so all these things are underlying norms and conventions that we know, but we never think about them. So but they can be very different for our learners, of course. So the last thing I do in the preliminaries is talk about the fact that the other thing the book does is talk about different Englishes. So you might remember we did this before. We looked at these different Englishes. So traditional English would be what used to be called the inner circle. New Englishes like African English, Indian English, and then expanding circle English, which we can either call emerging English or is often described as English as a lingua franca, right? So that's between speakers who there's no native speaker of English involved. So what we know now is that there are some real differences between the way in which these intonation functions in these different varieties. So we can't just say it's English and we expect everybody to do the same thing. In fact, often we do say that we expect everyone to do the same thing, and that then becomes a problem because we don't do the same thing across all the varieties. All right. So in chapter 1, I start to talk about that and why does intonation matter? And it's because forms and functions of intonation are not universal. There are some universal tendencies across languages, such as a rising contour for indicating in very general terms unfinished business, and a falling contour in very general terms meaning finished business. But if you're, and that actually contributing to turn taking, for example, but it's very general. And as soon as you start getting down to different languages and then different varieties of language, these things stop working so well because of the pragmatic meanings of intonation, which have a lot more meanings than just finished or unfinished business. So we're going to have a look at an example. The book looks at an example of that, a pretty famous example by a guy called John Gumperz, who was this wonderful interactional sociolinguist who worked in England and in the US. And he was particularly interested in what he called the linguistic penalty, which was the problem that a lot of migrants suffered when they tried to get work in their new communities because their English was different. And he was really focused on this with in England with Indian English. So the new variety, Indian English is a new variety of English, and that has different rules than British English or American English. And it's the biggest, it still is the biggest group of immigrants that we have in England is people from East India. And so it was quite becoming quite a problem that the traditional English speakers like me, for example, and the new English speakers were sort of clashing and not understanding. And at least part of that turned out to be intonation. So one particular study he did, that's a famous study now, described what was happening in a workplace cafeteria. It was actually Heathrow Airport. And what was happening was there was a problem. The reason he was called in as an anthropological linguist was there was a problem between the women, the Indian and Pakistani women who were working in the cafeteria at Heathrow, and the largely white male population of baggage handlers and engineers and so on who were coming in to have their meals every day. And so, in other words, a clash between traditional English speakers from London and new English speakers from India or Pakistan. And what was happening was it was becoming quite a problem. These women were perceived as uncooperative and not very nice and surly, and the women themselves were just like, you know, nice normal women who couldn't understand why there was this problem. So one of the things he did was go in and do a bunch of interviews and do some work in there. And what he found was that when he looked at these interactions in the cafeteria, there was some really different uses of conventional intonation patterns. And these were causing a bunch of problems. One important one he found was if, for example, they asked a cargo handler, you know, if the woman at the cafeteria, he's coming down the line and she says, you know, do you want gravy on your meat? A British English speaker, a traditional English speaker would say gravy, meaning would you like some gravy? What the Indian women were saying was gravy, meaning do you want some gravy? But that's the way they would say it. To a British person, a British English speaker, this sounded incredibly rude. It sounded like it's gravy. You want it, you don't want it. You know, what do you want to, instead of a pleasant question, you know, would you like gravy? It was sort of like, here's the gravy, take it or don't gravy it, take it or don't take it, I don't care. So it was interpreted more as a demand than an offer, and was perceived as being very rude. There's a long quote here, but it's important. When the Indian women heard this, they began to understand reactions they'd been getting all along, which had until then seemed incomprehensible. They then spontaneously record intonation patterns that seemed strange to them when spoken by native English speakers. At the same time, supervisors learned that the Indian women's falling intonation was their normal way of asking questions, and no rudeness or indifference was intended. So this was a pretty big deal, because if it hadn't have been identified as a problem of a linguistic problem, it undoubtedly was being identified as a discrimination problem. Like, you know, so Indian women are not very nice, male British workers are not very nice, and now, you know, you've got a cross-cultural clash. So I think he explains, Gomprez explains that the women particularly were absolutely sure that this was about race, about racial discrimination against them. And it's sort of fascinating when you turn that around and you say, well, actually, everybody's just getting annoyed with everybody because of the way they're speaking, and there's no intent here to get annoyed. You know, no, not only is there no intent, no one even really knows this is happening. You know, this is the core, one of the core reasons that this is happening, right? And this is called, Don Rubin called this impression management. And what that means is, you know, let's say you walk into a job or you walk into an interview, and you've already got a very limited amount of time to make your impression, right? So, and a lot of, if you go to work coaches and job coaches, they'll talk about this kind of thing all the time. But one thing that's super important with impression management is intonation. because one thing that happens is that you make a decision about whether this person is a nice person or not a nice person. And you can make that decision super fast based on very, very limited pronunciation issues. So we know that what's perceived of as aggressive intonation, which can be, for example, there's some studies that show that younger Arabic men have, generally speaking, louder voices and higher pitches than American English speaking men. There's a study in the book later in my book that talks about this. Then that's then perceived. I mean, it's just it just is what it is. It's a difference that comes in with the learner because of some of the differences with Arabic, but it's perceived often as somebody being angry, you know, or sounding aggressive. So yeah, so that's the idea of impression management and why you want to make sure that you're working on this with your students. All right, so the rest of the first chapter spends its time talking about the historical approaches to intonation. And I think it's important. It's not important in the sense that you are going to write a paper about the history of intonation, like I did, but because it gives you an idea of why we're behind the 8 ball in this, in terms of not really recognizing the fundamental role of something like suprasegmentals or intonation until really late in the game, like the last sort of 20 or 30 years, and why we're still trying to catch up with that in our TESOL materials. So one of the first things is, of course, historically it was approached through traditional Englishes, so that means all the initial work was done in British English, and then you developed 2 traditions, a British English tradition of looking at intonation and an American English tradition. But both of those had the same notion of focusing on sentence structure. So when they were looking at the meaning of intonation and the importance of intonation, they were only looking at individual sentences. So in the UK, this was highly functionally oriented, and the focus was on contours, so individual contours. So if you were a learner in the 1950s learning British English, there was a model of intonation that your teacher might have presented to you, God help you, which had 300 separate contours of intonation contours that each had a different meaning that as a learner you were supposed to learn. So one was like, you know, this sounds like you're grumbling and sad, and then there's this sounds like you're happy, and then there's another one, this sounds like you're bewildered, and you would have to learn all these things, and it was kind of crazy because of course it wasn't just the intonation contour, it would be all the other things that went with that. In the US, it was much more grammar oriented, so it was much more syntax oriented, and what they tried to do with intonation was make it into a phoneme. So they would divide up the intonation system and say these are phonological phonemes just like vowels and consonants are. That didn't work very well either, because there were a lot of things that didn't fit well into a phonemic model, because intonation isn't phonemic in that sense. So, but there was still a high focus on affective meaning. In both cases, the really important part, and the part that matters for us too, is that the focus was on individual sentences. So you were trying to assess how intonation worked just by looking at individual utterances, instead of looking at intonation across utterances, right? So what happened in the 1970s and 80s was finally there was a recognition in syntax that we were missing a lot of the important stuff because we were focusing on drawing trees and things that happen just inside one sentence instead of focusing on looking at what happens across text. So, for example, one of the things that we've talked about before was new mention and old mention, right? So until you look at text, you can't understand why somebody says or the, for example, because you don't know whether they've mentioned it before or not mentioned it before. So you can't understand that part of syntax unless you look across a written or spoken text. Exactly the same way with intonation. There's a recognition that spoken text also has a much larger structure, and that intonation contributes to that structure, and that you can't describe all the functions and structures that intonation has if you will only look at individual sentences. It will take you down a garden path, and it's the wrong garden path. So because this is pretty, it takes about 20 to 30 years for ESL materials and pedagogical materials in general to kind of catch up. So we are still catching up with this. And so much of the books, many of the books that you will use still focus on these kind of approaches. And in fact, that was the reason that we didn't look at it in Sells Mercia, because I have an example of one thing that they did later on, and it's this old-fashioned approach, basically, of looking at it through syntax, which we don't want to do. So what happened was we get this idea of a multifunctional role. If you start looking at intonation across discourse, so across text. So you do find two of the functions that typically have been described for intonation. So a grammatical function and an attitudinal function. So if we look at the grammatical function, this encompasses a number of primarily structural functions. So this is what Anne was talking about when she said the use of a final rising or falling pitch to distinguish utterances on versus statements, or the employment of tone units, so the unit and the pause structure to disambiguate clauses. So things like, my wife, who lives in New York, loves dogs, versus my wife, who lives in New York, loves dogs. So do you hear the difference between those two? In the first case, he's only got one wife. And in the second case, the implication, he's got more than one wife, right? So my wife, who lives in New York, loves dogs. If you say it more like, my wife, who lives in New York, loves dogs, it sounds like there's another wife potentially, right? So there is some syntactic disambiguation that can go on between the use of pause and unit structure. And that comes under grammatical function. Attitudinal function is this thing that we talked about before, where there's like, if you say it like this, this means you're uncertain and not sure. If you say it like this, this means that you're angry and want them to do something, and so on. I mean, these labels go on and on and on. As I said, there was a model with 300 of these labels with little different contours attached to each of these labels. It didn't work then, and it doesn't work now, and we've recognized with the multimodality approaches to discourse that far too much was being put inside an intonation contour. So multimodality approaches to discourse mean that you look not only at the speech itself, so not only at the syntax of the speech, the intonation of the speech, the phonological structure, but also you start looking at eye gaze, you look at gesture, you look at smiling or not smiling. And what we realized was a lot of these labels that we were putting on intonation contours, so saying that this intonation contour means this attitude and this means that attitude, actually had to do with everything that was around that intonational choice as well. So eye gaze, gesture, smiling, and that if you changed these things, an individual contour could start to mean something different within a discourse context. So what we tend to do now is keep it quite broad. So instead of having lots and lots of different labels, we will say, okay, there are broad spectrums of emotion. For example, the louder I get, particularly with strong prominences, the more angry I sound, right? So there isn't a special contour that goes with sounding angry, but if you put a cluster of variables together, you will sound angry, right? So, but it's a lot of different things that come together that give that impression. So we don't have, even though your book does, which is another reason, not my book, the Self-Mercia book, it's another reason we don't use it, because it's not, it doesn't work very well. You can find counter examples of everything they come up with all the time. Then we have this, and again, sorry, this is way too much text for one, but this is all in the book, obviously. The priority is discourse function, because that covers both informational aspects of intonation and interactional ones. By that, I mean, we will look at how we use intonation systematically to distinguish pieces of information. So old information, new information. You might distinguish between, you'll have a certain voice pitch, and then you'll say something as an aside, and so your voice goes down and your tone changes, and then you come back to the real. So there are lots and lots of ways in which we use intonation at utterance boundaries. We're going to look at something called pitch paragraphs, which work exactly the same way as written paragraphs do, that as speakers change topics, they will change paragraph. You know, they'll have a beginning and a closing in pitch, as opposed to in writing, and they're called paratones instead of paragraphs. So we can use that as a large boundary. And then also we use it in turn taking. So that's interactional. We use pitch level in turn taking to indicate when we're finishing a turn or starting a turn. We use it to give a sense of whether we're open to possibilities, or whether we're stating a factual announcement, or we don't want to hear your opinion about it. So all these kinds of things that contribute to relationship building. So we're going to look at all of that. That all comes under discourse function. And then the last function that's really recognized now under discourse intonation is what's called an indexical function, which comes from sociolinguistics, and essentially is if you have a specific kind of intonation pattern that marks your affiliation with a sociocultural group. And the by far the one that used to be talked about was Valley Girl speech. So, you know, when like teenagers from California, I went to the store and I saw all my friends, and then when we went to the cinema, and so they have a constant rising tone at the end of it, and it's called mall speak or Valley Girl speak, or it used to be. Now these days it's one of the ones that drives everyone crazy. And an example, you'll look at examples in my book, is vocal fry or creak, which a lot of youngsters, so this is like called millennial speak by many people, and it's the thing where the speaker will go like that and just drift off like so. Yeah, so I was like, walking along, and then I was thinking, and then they have this so that's called vocal fry or vocal creak. And it has become, it's something that older people say happens all the time with younger people and they don't like. And we have a couple of articles about that, so that we'll take a look at. So those are the 4 multifunctional areas. And if you've done any work at all with intonation and ESL pedagogy, you've probably only done these first 2. You've done something about rising and falling tones, and you've probably done something about sounding happy or sounding unhappy. You probably have not done either of these 2. And this 3rd one is where we're going to spend all of our time, essentially. So, but we're also going to talk about why these 2 don't work, okay? And it's primarily because although they're part of the system, they're a part of it. So if you try and make the entire system and understand the entire system based just on the grammatical function, you can't, because that's not where the meaning of the system lies, okay? But we'll look at that. We'll get to that. All right. So here's an example of what Anne was talking about, I think. So this is actually from your book, from your Self-Mercia book. And this is a classic syntactic approach to intonation. So what they call a syntactic declarative pattern versus an interrogative pattern. So in this case, Self-Mercia has 3 levels. 3, 2, 1 is like, I can't find the cat. I can't find the cat, right? So it's all on level 2, and you have a, what is it? Wait a minute, I can't find the cat. Okay, that's the way it's supposed to be. 2, 3, 1. That's written wrong. I can't find the cat. Okay, and that's a declarative pattern. And then you've got an interrogative pattern. Is the cat in here? Is the cat in here? So that's the idea of a syntactic base. Now, there's nothing wrong with that per se, except for you can have questions that sound like statements and statements that sound like questions, which is what we'll look at in a sec. So that's why it doesn't work. So for example, I can give you an example. You can say, are you leaving? Or you can say, are you leaving? Okay. The first one has a rising tone. Are you leaving? The second one has a falling tone. Are you leaving? Both of them are questions. Both of them are interrogative. The difference is not syntactic. Okay. You're not making a choice of rising or falling based on the syntax, which is what this presupposes when you look at this example. Okay, the choice you're making is based on something else. For example, are you leaving? Means, oh, this is a surprise to me. It looks like you're leaving. Versus, are you leaving? It looks like you're leaving. Are you leaving? Right. So that example comes back in the book in chapter 2 or 3 or something. So we'll look more at that. But my point remains that you can't distinguish all interrogatives and all declaratives using intonation and intonation can be used, either part can be used to do both. So that can't be the fundamental meaning of the contours to be able to do that. So that's the first one. This also comes out of your book. This is the second approach that you have a lot, which is this idea of emotional contours, which is the attitudinal effect, right? That depending upon how you use the contour, you show a certain attitude. Now, it's no surprise that when they do these kinds of examples, they're always something dramatic, because in fact, this doesn't really work without the correct facial features and everything else. It's not just the intonation that carries it, it's everything else about it. So it's always something like, my wife is pregnant, like, you know, that's sort of like, whoo, or enthusiasm, my wife is pregnant, you know. So you can hear that in addition to the contour, I'm also like, you know, I'm all sort of excited, and I have gestures, and I have eye contact, and you know, my wife is pregnant is supposed to be disinterest. Why you would ever say my wife is pregnant in a disinterested way is beyond me. But as I say, when you look at these examples, they're always like that. They're always something bizarre or something dramatic, because it's the only way you can make these examples work. So these, as I say, are just two very typical examples of how textbooks typically approach. And it's difficult because your learners, this one, for example, your learners will, if you've got a live one in your classroom, they'll say, but I could also make a question with a falling tone, right? And you realize, oh yeah, well, you can do that. So what's the difference? So obviously the difference isn't between a statement and a question, there's something else. And then you're kind of stuck because you've only got this model. Here, I mean, I don't even know how this is a sort of tiny version of the 300 contours that O'Connor and Arnold produced in the 1950s and 60s, and we're still trying to produce, you know, and it just, you know, it doesn't work. I particularly love disbelief. My wife is pregnant, but she's 49 years old. Yeah, so anywho, we won't be using my wife is pregnant examples in my book, I'm delighted to say. So because of those kinds of problems, this is why we begin from a completely different place. So we don't begin from grammar, statement versus question. We don't begin from attitudinal or affective meaning. We say that it's incorporated into, those meanings are incorporated into a much larger system that's very explanatory, that gives you a reason why you can say, are you leaving versus are you leaving? And it has nothing to do with the syntax. It has to do with the discourse pragmatic meaning. All right. There you go. That was my first. So now, Caroline, I'm sure you're completely horrified at this point.
Just a little bit.
Bear with me. Bear with me. I promise you it will be okay. If you didn't read the book yet, you go ahead and read that preliminary bit and that first chapter, and this, you know, because I've pulled a lot out of there, this all comes out of there. So that will be the second time around that you read it, and it will begin to start making more sense to you. Questions, comments, observations? Stunned into silence, sorry. Yeah. Anyway, the more we do it, the better it'll get. Okay. So in that case, then let's talk about your reading post. At the end of every chapter in the book, there's a check your own learning. So that's also good for you if you can. I'm going to make you do that every week. And the idea is if there's something that you don't understand, then you'll get a sense. If you can't define it, if you can't say what it is in the check your own learning, then you know you need to go back and have a look. And then there's also always a couple of exercises or things that exercises about intonation in general, or things you might remember. Or so in chapter 1, and I'm ask you to do either the first or the second one there. And that, so check your own learning is definitions. So for example, why is studying intonation important? What's the main difference between British and American that you can have a look at in your book? And then the activities, you're just going to pick one of these. The first one's about My Fair Lady. I don't know how many of you have seen My Fair Lady, but he spends a whole time, talking about her intonation, how her intonation is monotonic and not interesting enough. And the second one is about John Gumpress's stuff. So that's for your reading post. Now your activity for this week is connected to your final semester activity of 5 lesson plans. So as part of this course, you're going to produce a week of pronunciation lesson plans. So that's 5 50-minute lesson plans. And what I want to do in this activity is practice the format for the activity so that when you come to do your final weeks of lesson plans, you know exactly what's expected to, so there's no surprises and you're not going to suddenly lose lots of points or whatever. So for this activity, you're going to just create one lesson activity for a 50-minute lesson. So just one lesson, and you can choose any pronunciation issue that you want to work with. What I've done is given you a sample lesson of what you need to produce in this week's materials under activity 6. It says sample lesson activity. It's one of your colleagues from a previous semester who did a nice job. It's not perfect, but it's a nice job. If you did this, this is what I'm looking for. It's a solid and it's well done and it's detailed and it's well put together. So you're going to turn in the following. You can turn it in using the format you see on the sample lesson plan. It will be a rationale explaining why you've chosen your particular pronunciation focus. Is it designed for a specific group of students? Does it deal with high functional load items? Does it fit a specific context of learning? In other words, there has to be a reason why you've picked what you've picked. Does it deal with a common transfer error, for example? It's got to be a rationale for why you've picked that. And then the lesson plan itself. And the lesson plan should include all those things: the student population, the goals of the lesson, the objectives, the materials and equipment, the procedures, including timing, how your 50 minutes is divided up, how you will assess what it is you've worked on, and the homework that goes with the lesson. So as I say, that model of a rationale and lesson plan, I have given you a model under sample lesson plan, so yours can look different as long as you include the same amount of detail and the same ideas. Yeah. And
clarification, is this pronunciation issues that are segmentals, like the consonant?
Yeah, we've only done segmentals so far, and so unless you want to unless you have right, I would do something that we've done already, and hold off on the super segmental lesson plans until the end. Then you can have multiple aspects to your last final week. But for this one, I'd choose something that you're comfortable with, that we've looked at already. Yeah. As long as the rationale makes sense, you know, then there just needs to be a rationale to go with the lesson, and the objectives need to be clear. I would pick, you can pick anything you want, but I would pick something that we've covered in the last 8 weeks that you're comfortable with. That's a great question. Anybody else? All right, well, in that case, then I'm done with you. Thank you for coming in. I will stay put. If anybody wants to hold on and ask me any questions, I will stay here. Otherwise, thank you very much, and I'll see you all next week.